There are moments in life that don't whisper, they scream. Moments so raw they pull the air from your lungs and leave your mind spinning like it's trying to make sense of a nightmare while you're still wide awake. That moment came for Ethan on a gray, wind-bitten afternoon in Brooklyn. 1 minute, he was walking to his favorite cafe for a quiet cup of coffee. The next, he was frozen at the entrance, his heart cracking open like glass under pressure. Inside, sitting close at a corner table, were his best friend and his ex-girlfriend, laughing, leaning in, sharing a world he was no longer part of. No explanation, no warning, just betrayal served black, no sugar. Everything inside Ethan surged: danger, shame, disbelief. His jaw clenched, his pulse pounded. The universe had narrowed to a single point of pain, and all he wanted was yelling, breaking something, storming in and unleashing every ounce of hurt he felt. He turned away, fists tight, breath jagged, trying to swallow the fire inside. That's when he saw the old man, sitting alone on a nearby bench in Prospect Park, calmly feeding a circle of pigeons, was a stranger who didn't seem to belong in this century, much less in the chaos of Ethan's emotional tornado. Flat cap, old coat, eyes sharp with a kind of ancient knowing. The man looked up at Ethan, saw him, really saw him, and nodded, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. Quite the storm, huh? The old man said gently. Ethan didn't answer, but something in his rage hesitated. The stranger patted the bench beside him, never breaking eye contact. Ethan, curious, desperate. Maybe boss sat down. And then came the sentence that would begin Ethan's transformation. No one can make you angry, son. That part's on you. The words hit harder than betrayal ever could. Ethan scoffed. Are you kidding? You don't know what just happened. I don't need to, the old man said. What happened outside of you is just data. But what happened inside, that's your domain. You gave them the keys to your peace, and now you're mad. They drove off with it. That man was Mr. Vega, retired executive, a self-made Stoic, a teacher of truths too uncomfortable for most to confront. That park bench, on that bitter Brooklyn afternoon, became Ethan's first classroom in the lost art of emotional sovereignty. Mr. Vega explained that anger doesn't come from the event. It comes from the story we attach to the event. Ethan wasn't just seeing two people share coffee. He was seeing himself as betrayed, disrespected, unloved. That interpretation created the fury, not the facts. And the most devastating realization. That meant Ethan had built his own suffering. And if he had the power to create it, maybe he had the power to stop it. That realization doesn't land softly. It crashes. It strips you of excuses. It exposes the terrifying truth that you are not a victim of your emotions or their author. But it also unlocks the door to a kind of freedom most people will never taste, because if no one can make you angry, they also can't control your peace. That power, once reclaimed, is absolute. Mr. Vega looked out at the lake and said, every time you react with rage, you give the world your leash. But if you learn to pause, to watch, to choose, you become untouchable. Not cold, not indifferent, just ... sovereign. Ethan didn't become calm that day, but something shifted, a crack in the armor of blame, a seed of possibility, and that's where his journey began. If you want to follow where this story led, trust me, it goes places you won't expect. Make sure to hit the subscribe button. That's how we keep creating stories that challenge, awaken, and change lives. Now here's your moment of reflection. Let's interact. Question: which of these is more powerful in shaping your emotional state? A. The events that happen to you. B. The interpretation you give to those events. Drop your answer in the comments. A or B. And let's see. How many of us are truly in charge of our emotions? The city never really sleeps. But there are corners of Manhattan where time seems to pause. Old bookstores with creaking floorboards, yellowed pages, and stories waiting quietly on shelves. That's where Ethan found himself the following weekend, wandering through the aisles, like a man searching for something he couldn't quite name. He didn't expect to see Mr. Vega again, but there he was, in a leather chair tucked beside a dusty philosophy section, flipping through a worn copy of Epictetus. His presence felt almost orchestrated, like fate had set an appointment Ethan didn't realize he'd made. "Still angry?" Mr. Vega asked, not even looking up. Ethan smiled, more from disbelief than anything else. "Less than before, but it sneaks in, like it's waiting for me to let my guard down." Mr. Vega closed the book and set it on the table. "That's because you haven't trained the gap yet." "The gap?" Ethan asked. Mr. Vega leaned in. "The space between what happens to you and what you do about it. Most people don't even know it exists. But inside that space is everything: freedom, power, peace. That's what Stoics mastered. That's what you need to cultivate." He paused, as if allowing the weight of that idea to sink in. "The sacred pause, Ethan. That's the difference between being a slave to emotion and being a sovereign over it." Ethan sat down. His whole life had been a series of reactions. He'd never considered the possibility of choosing a response instead of defaulting to one. Mr. Vega continued. "Imagine someone insults you. Instinct says snap back, defend yourself, escalate. But if you pause, just for a moment, you insert consciousness into the equation. You ask, is this worth my energy? What's the wisest way to respond? You reclaim authorship of your action." He handed Ethan a small, pocket-sized notebook. On the front were the words, "Pause, breathe, choose. Every time you get triggered this week," he said, "write it down, but don't react right away. Give yourself 5 seconds. Name the emotion, then respond not from impulse, but from intention." It sounded simple, but putting it into practice was another story. That afternoon, Ethan stood in line at a food truck when someone cut right in front of him. Instant irritation, surged heat rising in his chest, jaw tightening. He reached for his notebook, annoyed, disrespected, like I'm invisible. He paused, breathed, and something unexpected happened. The intensity shrank. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to make it a moment. He just let it pass. It was his first taste of power, not over someone else, but over himself. Over the next few days, the notebook filled, not with complaints, but with insights. Every pause became a window into his inner world. He began to notice patterns of day he was more reactive, situations that triggered old wounds, words that stirred insecurities. But he also discovered something else. Silence wasn't weakness. It was a flex of inner strength. Responding calmly didn't mean avoiding emotion, meant directing it, like a skilled boxer who doesn't swing wildly, but waits, watches, and strikes with clarity. One night over tea, Ethan shared this insight with Mr. Vega. "You were right," he said. "The pause is everything. But it's also ... terrifying, because it forces me to sit with myself. No distraction. Just me and the truth." Mr. Vega nodded. "That's the work, Ethan. Most people fear the pause because they fear what it reveals. But the Stoic doesn't run from discomfort. He leans into it. He turns it into a forge." There's a quote Mr. Vega loved to repeat, one that became etched in Ethan's mind. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and our growth. The sacred pause wasn't just a technique. It was a way of living. It taught Ethan that his emotions weren't enemies, they were messengers. And every time he paused, he heard them more clearly. He was still learning, still stumbling, but now, every reaction was a chance to practice. Every trigger, an invitation to mastery. The gap was no longer empty. It was sacred. And for the first time in his life, Ethan had begun to step into it with purpose. By the time spring rolled into Brooklyn, Something had shifted in Ethan, not just in how he felt, but in how he saw. His world wasn't calmer because the chaos had stopped. The chaos was still. There rooted strangers, deadlines, misunderstandings, betrayals that still stung when remembered. But Ethan was beginning to understand that the real storm had never been outside him. It had always been the story he told himself about what everything meant. That story had been running his life, and he hadn't even realized it. It hit him one morning as he sat at his tiny kitchen table, sunlight cutting across his journal like a spotlight on a stage. He was writing about a recent argument with a coworker, something small, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. As he recounted the event, he heard himself writing the same script he always had. They don't respect me. People always underestimate me. I have to prove my worth. Then he stopped. It was like watching a bad play for the 100th time and finally realizing you don't have to be the actor repeating these tired lines. You can rewrite the script. You can be the author. He remembered something Mr. Vega once told him over coffee. Most people live inside a story they didn't write. Childhood handed them the first draft. Society added chapters, trauma-filled, and the rest. But if you're brave, you can take the pen back. So Ethan took the pen back. He started rewriting the story, not just in metaphor, but literally. For every emotionally charged event, he'd write it from two perspectives. The one he reflexively felt, and the one he chose. The shift was small but seismic. Where once he wrote, "They ignored my idea in the meeting. I'm invisible," he rewrote. "They didn't respond the way I expected. Maybe I didn't communicate clearly. How can I express it better next time?" It wasn't about lying to himself. It was about reclaiming control. Reframing wasn't denial, it was designed out around this time. Ethan joined a small Stoic discussion group in a quiet cafe downtown. That's where he met Camila, a marketing strategist from Austin, who had gone through a brutal divorce the year before. She spoke with a quiet strength, like someone who had drowned before but learned to breathe underwater. Camila shared how journaling saved her, but not just any journaling. She wrote as if she were narrating her own story from the outside, like a wise observer watching her life unfold with compassion and clarity. Writing in the third person changed everything, she said. It gave me distance. It helped me stop identifying with my pain and start learning from it. Inspired, Ethan tried it. Each night, he'd write a short paragraph about the day, not as Ethan, but about Ethan, like a character in a book. Ethan felt discouraged after the presentation flopped, but he recognized that fear was amplifying the failure. He reminded himself that courage isn't the absence of discomfort, it's moving forward in spite of it. It was strange at first, but over time, the third-person view gave him something he never had before: perspective. He began noticing how often he used words like always and never, how often he assumed the worst, how often his language painted him as powerless. So he started editing, not just the sentences, but the beliefs beneath them. I'm always rejected became, sometimes things don't work out, and that's okay. I can't handle this became, this is hard, but I've handled worse. Language, he realized, wasn't just communication, it was construction. Every word either built a prison or a bridge. And now that he was the author, he chose bridges. One evening, after a long walk through Prospect Park, Ethan sat under a tree with his notebook in his lap. The breeze carried the smell of spring and the distant laughter of kids playing tag. He wrote just one line that night. Today, I chose the story of resilience over the story of rejection. It wasn't a grand transformation. It wasn't magic, but it was a choice. And day by day, those choices were adding up. Ethan wasn't just changing his life, he was rewriting it, one sentence at a time. There are lessons in life that don't reveal themselves until the pain arrives. But what if the pain didn't catch you off guard? What if you could meet it at the door, not with fear, but with readiness? That was the heart of Mr. Vega's next lesson. It came on a quiet morning during a retreat in Lake Tahoe, a place so still it felt like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Ethan had joined a small weekend gathering hosted by Mr. Vega, who believed that nature softened the ego and made the soul more teachable. The setting was pristine, but what Ethan was about to learn had nothing to do with beauty. It had everything to do with loss. They were sitting near the edge of the lake, the mist still clinging to the surface like a secret. Mr. Vega skipped a stone across the water and said, almost casually, "Have you ever imagined your worst case scenario?" Ethan shrugged. "I've lived a few." "That's not what I asked," Mr. Vega replied. "I'm not talking about worry or anxiety. I'm talking about premeditation, Stoic premeditation. Deliberately visualizing what could go wrong, not to fear it, but to strip it of its power." He went on to explain the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. It's not about being pessimistic. It's about being prepared to think through potential setbacks, betrayals, failures, even death, not to manifest them, but to make peace with their possibility. Ethan listened, intrigued but unsure. Wasn't this just negative thinking? Mr. Vega saw the doubt on his face. When a pilot trains, do they only visualize perfect weather? No, they train for storms. So when the storm comes, they don't panic. They execute. That hit different. That afternoon, Ethan sat alone by the water and began the exercise. He imagined losing his job, his savings, his health. He pictured friends turning on him, plans falling apart, doors closing. He didn't do it to scare himself. He did it to ask, what would I do? Who would I become if this happened? It was sobering, but it wasn't dark. It was clarifying. And then he imagined losing Mr. Vega. The thought punched him in the chest, but instead of looking away, he leaned in, and what he felt after the sadness wasn't despair, it was gratitude. Deep, aching gratitude for every word, every moment, every lesson they'd shared. That's when Ethan understood the real power of premeditation. It wasn't just about preparing for the worst. It was about cherishing the now. When you realize everything can be taken, you stop taking things for granted. The next morning, they hiked through the pine forests above the lake. Mr. Vega shared a story about a young athlete named Tariq. He'd once coached in Chicago. Tariq trained 4 months for a championship race only to sprain his ankle 2 days before the event. It should have broken him, but it didn't, because every day of training, Tariq had mentally rehearsed failure. He had prepared not just his body, but his mind for disappointment. When the injury came, he didn't spiral. He pivoted. He became a coach, and later, a mentor to others who faced setbacks of their own. Resilience, Mr. Vega said, isn't built in the moment of crisis. It's built in the preparation before it. That night, Ethan started a new ritual, morning previews. Each morning, he would write down 3 things that could go wrong. Not to be cynical, but to meet the day with grounded readiness. He'd then close with a simple affirmation. Even if these things happen, I will respond with wisdom, grace, and strength. It changed how he moved through the world. Traffic delays didn't unravel him. Misunderstandings didn't pierce him. Even moments of rejection began to feel ... lighter, because he had already met them in his mind and welcomed them. He wasn't hoping bad things would happen, but he stopped hoping they wouldn't. And in that release of fragile expectations, he found something stronger, emotional armor not built of steel, but of perspective. Ethan came back from Tahoe quieter, not subdued, but solid. He had seen the worst, not in fear but in foresight. And now, when life surprised him, he didn't flinch. He just nodded, like someone who had already seen this scene before, and wrote the next one anyway. Pain as a way of making everything feel smaller. Rooms feel tighter. Futures feel further. And for Ethan, that feeling hit hardest the day his startup collapsed. Months of work, late nights, pitching investors, building a team, believing in something bigger than himself, gone in a single phone call. The funding was pulled. The dream unraveled. He stood in his kitchen holding his phone like a ghost of a former self, disbelief sinking into silence. The silence became a weight, and the weight became sadness. Then the sadness hardened into shame. That's when the real spiral began. But something had shifted in him since the days of raging in Prospect Park. Instead of numbing out or distracting himself, he sat down at his desk, opened a blank page, and wrote the first sentence that came to him. This is not the end. This is the beginning of something I can't yet see. It felt forced, hollow even, but he wrote it anyway. Later that week, Ethan flew to Portland to visit an old friend and clear his head. That's where he met Leela, spoken word poet, who had turned heartbreak into her greatest art. They crossed paths at a small poetry night in a downtown coffee shop. Her voice was fire and calm all at once, and when she finished her piece, Ethan found himself both shattered and strangely soothed. They talked afterward. He told her what had happened. She listened, nodded, and said something he'd never forget. Pain is just unprocessed power. If you don't give it a voice, it'll find one anyway through anger, withdrawal, self-doubt. But if you listen to it, it'll hand you something holy. Layla invited him to try something simple. Write a letter, not to anyone else, but to himself from his pain. Not to solve it, but to hear it. That night, back in his Airbnb, Ethan lit a candle, opened his journal, and let the pain speak. Dear Ethan, you tried. That matters more than the outcome. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to remind you that your worth was never tied to that company. I'm the echo of your devotion. Let me move through you, not destroy you. By the end of the page, he was crying, but not from defeat, from relief. He wrote letters like that every night for a week. He started turning them into poems, then spoken reflections. Not for an audience, but for himself. Each piece was an alchemy, the transformation of confusion into clarity, sorrow into strength. Ethan was learning that emotional mastery wasn't about feeling less. It was about feeling more intentionally. Instead of letting pain control him, he started creating with it. The pain became paint. It became rhythm. It became prayer. Layla called it creative processing, taking raw emotion and channeling it through expression, giving it shape so it wouldn't shapeshift into something destructive. It didn't make the pain vanish, but it made it sacred. He began experimenting voice memos when anxiety crept in, sketching when he couldn't sleep, writing what this emotion would say if it had words. It wasn't about being an artist. It was about being honest. There was power in that. Real power. Mr. Vega, when Ethan shared all this with him later, simply smiled and said, "Now you're not just surviving, you're synthesizing." That's Stoicism, too. It's not emotionless. It's emotion in its most elevated, form-directed, understood, respected. Ethan no longer feared emotional storms. He welcomed them like weather, temporary, intense, but meaningful. He stopped seeing his sensitivity as a weakness and started honoring it as a kind of compass. It didn't always point toward comfort, but it always pointed toward truth. And that's what he wanted now. Not perfection, not invincibility, just truth, lived and spoken and written without apology. He looked back one day at his original journal, entry from the day everything fell apart. He smiled, not because it didn't hurt anymore, but because it had meaning now. That failure had given birth to a part of him that was stronger, softer, and more whole. He had turned pain into power by resisting it, but by listening to it, and that changed everything. There's a quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't shout, doesn't posture, doesn't perform. It simply is steady, grounded, and unmistakably free. Ethan didn't recognize that kind of strength until he started living it. Months had passed since the collapse, since the journaling, the meditations, the silence, The letters written to pain and to possibility. His external life hadn't become picture perfect. He still had bills. He still faced rejection. The world didn't suddenly turn gentle, but something within him had become immovable. He wasn't chasing peace anymore. He was peace. Not because life stopped testing him, but because he stopped needing life to behave for him to be okay. He'd begun teaching workshops, small gatherings of young adults, searching for something they couldn't quite name. Most weren't philosophers. They were creators, students, coders, baristas, artists. But they were tired of being at the mercy of every mood, every notification, every approval or disapproval from the outside world. Ethan shared with them not what he had read, but what he had lived. The sacred pause, the reframing, the premeditation, the alchemy. And now, the anchoring. Freedom, he told them, is not escaping pain. It's not pretending nothing touches you. It's waking up and knowing that whatever the world throws at you today, you still get to choose how you carry it. The room always got quiet when he said that, because deep down, everyone knew how often they had handed their peace away through arguments, comparison, disappointment, fear. Stoicism wasn't armor. It was awareness. It wasn't detachment. It was depth. Ethan reminded them of that. He started something new, a weekly gathering called The Circle, just 10 people. Once a week, sitting in a circle, reflecting. No one had to be wise. No one had to be fixed. They just had to be honest. They'd share what tested them that week, what triggered them, what they learned. Then they'd write a short Stoic oath for the week ahead. Personal commitment to live, not reactively, but deliberately. Ethan's own oath, scrawled on a note card. Read, I vow to remain the observer of my emotions, not their hostage. I vow to speak truth without cruelty and listen without defense. I vow to meet discomfort with dignity and setbacks with structure. I vow to remember that everything outside my mind is outside my control and that peace lives only within. That to him was living stoic, not some cold, rigid suppression of feeling, but a reverence for clarity, choice, and inner authority. He didn't need applause for it. He didn't need agreement. And that was the point. He walked through his days now with the same challenges as anyone else: traffic, missed calls, misread texts, awkward conversations, late nights, broken plans, but nothing owned him anymore. There was still hurt sometimes, still frustration, but it passed through him instead of taking root. Like weather. Once, someone in the circle asked, how do you know if it's working? Ethan smiled. When life gets loud, and you don't, that's how you know. The journey hadn't made him invincible. It had made him available to beauty, to sorrow, to wonder, to truth. He wasn't trying to control everything anymore. He was trying to respond to everything as someone who had already done the work. He still saw Mr. Vega from time to time. The old man never claimed to have answers, only questions that opened doors. One evening, as they sat together on the same bench in Prospect Park where it all began, Mr. Vega turned to him and said, "You're not angry anymore, are you?" Ethan shook his head. "Not like before. Anger used to be the only voice I trusted. Now I know it's just one of many, and I choose who I listen to." Mr. Vega grinned. "Then you've learned the rarest skill of all, to belong fully to yourself." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. In that moment, the city moved around them, honking cars, rushing footsteps, the buzz of 1,000 lives all colliding, and yet, within him, there was stillness, unshakable, unbothered, unmistakably free. Ethan's journey began in the heat of betrayal, a moment so sharp it carved a crack through everything he thought he understood about himself. He stood at the edge of Prospect Park with rage in his chest and confusion in his heart, thinking he'd been broken by others, but what he came to learn was far more humbling. He had been broken by a story he had been telling himself his entire life, and that story was about to change. It didn't change overnight. There were no grand epiphanies. no magical peace descending from the sky. What happened instead was much slower, much quieter, but much more permanent. It began with a stranger named Mr. Vegaman, who asked him a question most people never stop to consider. What if your emotions weren't caused by the world, but created by you? That one question unraveled the foundation of Ethan's emotional reflexes. From there, he discovered the sacred pause, the moment between stimulus and response where the power to choose lives. He began noticing the patterns, the moments he gave away his freedom, and the places where a simple breath could return it. And once he mastered the pause, he stepped into something deeper, the author's seat. No longer a passive character in his own life, Ethan began rewriting the narratives that had bound him to old beliefs. The stories of not being enough, the internal dialogue of failure, rejection, abandonment. They were just that, stories, and stories could be edited. He learned to practice premeditation, not just as mental rehearsal, but as a posture of graceful anticipation. He started preparing for loss, discomfort, disappointment, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. It didn't make him cynical, it made him free. Because when you prepare for the worst doesn't own you, and the best feels even more precious. But the most powerful shift came when Ethan stopped running from pain. When the startup failed, when the silence got loud, when the darkness of shame crept in, he sat with it. He listened. He let the pain speak, and then he turned its language into art, into reflection, into something useful. He didn't just survive the pain, he transmuted it. By the time Ethan began teaching others, the man who once boiled with anger had become something entirely different. Not emotionless, not untouchable, but present, calm, capable. He no longer needed the world to change for him to feel okay. He had built a peace within himself that couldn't be shaken, because it wasn't built on comfort, it was built on truth. So what's the lesson in Ethan's story? It's that self-mastery isn't a destination, it's a devotion. It's a daily practice of owning your narrative, pausing when you want to react, preparing for storms before they hit, and transforming pain into wisdom. It's knowing that you can't control the world, but you can control how you meet it. In a world that thrives on distraction, noise, and blame, living like this is revolutionary. It means choosing clarity over chaos, choosing authorship over choosing presence over performance. And you don't need to be a philosopher or a monk to do it. You just need to be willing to slow down, willing to question your story, willing to sit with discomfort, and most importantly, willing to begin. Because freedom isn't found in what happens, it's found in how you hold it. So now, I want to ask you, what part of Ethan's story resonated with you the most? Was it the moment of betrayal, the pause, the rewrite, the pain, or the peace? And how do you personally manage your emotional reactions in challenging situations? Let us know in the comments. Your insight could help someone else today. And if this story moved you, helped you see something more clearly, or simply reminded you that change is possible, invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating honest, meaningful content for people like you who are ready to live with clarity, purpose, and strength. We've only just begun.